Hello, fellow armchair historians. Welcome to the show. I'm Anne Marie Cannon, your host, historical fiction author, and curious soul always chasing the human side of history. Show notes include my website, links to content discussed in the episode, how to support the show, and a free short story download that introduces readers to Bedlam from my soon-to-be-released historical fiction series. On this podcast, my guests share the history they love most, and we experience it through their eyes. What fascinates them, what they've uncovered, and why the story still matters. Let's get into it. Today I'm joined by author Gigi Berardi, whose novel Bianca's Cure brings us into the world of Bianca Capello, one of Renaissance Italy's most fascinating and mysterious women. In this conversation, we explore the history of Bianca Capello in Florence, the world of alchemy and early medicine, the shadow of malaria in Renaissance Italy, and the hidden ways women pursued knowledge and influence in a world determined to limit them. Gigi also shares how years of research, time spent in Florence, and close attention to the historical record helped shape this novel and its central question. Not just what happened, but what could have happened. Here's my conversation with Gigi Berardi. Gigi Berardi, welcome to the show and thank you for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm so excited. I've been reading about you and your very interesting background. So let's just get right off to the races. And I'm going to ask you, what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
Oh, my favorite history is the history that has dozens and dozens of different versions, and or at least one other different version, and that challenges our ideas about what happened and what is happening.
Specifically, maybe you could be a little more specific. That's a little cryptic.
So typically when I'm writing, which allows me to think about the histories more, it is 19th century or 20th century history of land management, history of land tenders and managers. And so Bianca's Cure, what we're going to talk about today, is a departure for me. It's Renaissance history. I have to say that is one of my favorite histories because every summer for the past 15 years, consistently, I've been in Florence, the birthplace, so-called, of the Renaissance. So I can't help but be fascinated with late Renaissance history in particular, because you see it everywhere in Florence and experience it.
Yeah, love Renaissance history. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your very diverse background? And sometimes it kind of highlights why you've written this book, but I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm really interested to see like where you came into this story, but let's just kind of get a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I guess one theme in my background is storytelling. And a lot of that has been in a kind of scholarly academic way. So my students ask me what I did before I was a professor, and I tell them I was a baby. I mean, I feel like I was born to researching questions and telling stories and alternative stories. I grew up in Southern California and went through the University of California system and eventually ended up at the University of Sussex and then Cornell for my graduate work. And the stories there that I was interested in revolved around food. So when I was writing Bianca's Cure, a 10-year process, to be fair, looking at how long it took, I did write another book, creative nonfiction on food called FoodWISE, and develop other programs. So, questions around food and access to food And then my life could really be seen through the lens of academia. I've held 4 tenure-track positions, and I've been at College of the Environment, Western Washington University now for 30 years. And there they tolerate my nonfiction and fiction pursuits as part of my work that I'm interested in, and they recognize it as such. So I would say, in terms of Bianca's Cure, this novel that I became very, very interested in Italy once I could speak Italian, other than the dialect that I heard as a baby, and found that the more I learned about Italy, the more I lived there, the more questions I had, and the deeper could be my response in answering those questions.
Like my question is College of the Environment and in historical fiction, they just seem to not go together. So what is it that you teach in the College of the Environment? It sounds very scientific to me.
Yeah, so in College of the Environment, I teach research and writing classes.
Oh,
So
okay.
that maybe isn't obvious. Yes, I teach writing proficiency
Oh, okay.
classes. I teach other classes around sustainability and conservation, in particular about food production, processing, but also eating food, thinking good food, tasting good food, and very experiential oriented classes. And I'm just fortunate that in my department, which is called Urban and Environmental Planning and Policy, that they embrace different ways of telling stories. So this is a story about a woman scientist, a woman alchemist. It's about different kinds of science, different ways of knowing. And my colleagues are very critical scholars, and they question the cultural assumptions embedded in the lenses that they use and we use to look at the world. So they're welcoming this book.
So tell us about the person, Bianca, who she is in history.
In history, we know her as a woman in Venice, and that's really important because at that time there were many women alchemists in Venice. So she's coming from that milieu. She comes from Venice. She escaped Venice with Piero Bonaventure, who would become her first husband and the father of her first child. We know that she ended up in Florence, where Piero was from. We know that she somehow met, and there's been stories about this, but Francesco de' Medici, he was a prince, he was a duke, and eventually Grand Duke of Tuscany. And they had a love affair for 15 years, and then they got married. We know that. She had another child with Francesco. There's some controversy and scandal about that. We know that if you don't have to look very far to find stories talking about how they died on the same day, Francesco and Bianca, in October of 1587, but her body was never found. Francesco's body is in the Chapel of the Princes in Florence. It's been exhumed several times. We know that. As medical people and scholars have been looking for evidence of arsenic poisoning or malaria disease, and that is inconclusive. They found both, basically. We know that Bianca Capello had her own palace that is still there. We know, and this is important for my story, that Bianca Capello had her own room, her own study in Palazzo Vecchio in the Ducal Palace. That was a secret room. So there are 3 or so secret rooms on the secret room tour in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. One is a rooms of alchemy, or at the very least, study. And one was for Cosimo, Francesco's father, one was for Francesco, and one was for Bianca. And she inherited that from his mother, Eleonora. So that's what we know. We know her first husband was murdered in 1572. And what's interesting is in the 95,000 words of my novel, uh, I didn't go very far from embedding it in a lot of scholarship, and so I have like 8 color-coded ways to think and to verify and to confirm information. A lot of comments on the side with a lot of references, because all the time readers are asking, well, they're asking, did this happen? But then they shouldn't be reading historical fiction. So that's history. And but fair is to ask, could it have happened? And so what I've just described is the skeleton of what we know, and then kind of superimposed on that is, my 15 years in Florence specifically, but in Italy more than that, and my work with scholars in Florence and looking at original documents. I have images that I took of letters that Bianca wrote, for example. So that's what we know about the real Bianca. I think if you ask a taxi driver in Florence, the taxi driver will recognize Bianca Capello as Francesco's lover. Great love and a great beauty.
Interesting. So she now she was driven by finding a cure for malaria.
Mhm.
And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and how she kind of becomes obsessed with that. I assume that information is part of the skeleton of which you spoke. And so let's kind of jump off from there and then start talking about how you creatively filled in the this could have happened part of your historical fiction novel.
So she was an alchemist. She was interested in alchemy, that we know from the physical room. Although on the tour, sometimes it's referred to as the room of collections. And actually, Francesco's studiolo, his study, this amazing treasure chest of art, which is a secret room in Palazzo Vecchio, was also referred to as a room of collections. We do not know that Bianca herself was working on a cure for malaria. What we do know is that Francesco had had malaria a number of times. His mother had died of malaria. 2 brothers had died of malaria. Everybody was dying of malaria.
Mhm.
We know that she was in Venice in this milieu of alchemy, of herbal alchemy. We know that there were plenty, plenty, and plenty of men who were using alchemy to create new dyes, new pigments, new solvents. So, industrial uses of alchemy, primarily, for example, in textiles. We know that was a man's world and very difficult to enter. So that's what we know. So the situation wherein she is working with herbs on a cure for this particular disease, that is part of the fiction to make all that we know about her make sense. So I knew from other studies something about, I was not very clear, but Artemisia being used as a cure for malaria. And about the time that I started writing this, about the time that I started writing this, Tu Youyou in China became the first mainland Chinese national to win a Nobel Prize in a scientific category, which is amazing. A woman. And she won it for discovering the Artemisia isolate, the artemisinine, which is an extract of that, which is the active ingredient in malarial prophylactics and malaria cures. And this is about the time that Meredith Kay wrote her great book, Daughters of Alchemy, Women in Scientific Culture in Early Modern Italy. And she's writing about Venice as a hotbed of alchemic activity. We know that Venice was a great port, and it's not inconceivable that Artemisia cultivars, which grow wild almost, certain cultivars could have been brought over from China, from Cathay at the time. And of course, Tu Youyou won the Nobel Prize for spending decades and decades and decades looking at thousands of years of Chinese documentation on the use of Artemisia for malaria as a malarial cure. So her quest comes from an inciting incident, losing her mother and losing another patient. I won't say more than that, and being the great love of Francesco de' Medici, who was plagued with malaria. So that's what we know.
Two questions. One is, when they, in Renaissance time, they don't know what causes malaria, but it is the same disease of which we ascribe malaria to today from the mosquito, but they didn't know that at the time. Is that correct?
Malaria at that time in the Renaissance was referred to as as I just finished the Italian translation of the book, and I've had really healthy, warm arguments with the Italian editor as I've been translating it also with him. And questions, what do we call this disease? And in the book, it's called the heat disease, and he wanted to change this to something else. More common at the time would be the tertiary or quaternary disease. And so this kind of malaria, basically, just to crudely simplify, for the purposes of the book at least, there's two kinds of malaria, and there's two kinds of the hundreds that of mosquito vectors. And that is the Plasmodium vivax and the Plasmodium falciparum. And it is that falciparum malaria that's kind of the malaria we think about from sub-Saharan Africa or warmer environments. And it is a virtually fatal disease. And that fever spikes, and it doesn't have any cyclic pattern as the malaria from the other disease organism. That malaria is more typical from Sweden, from Norway to Italy, and even in recent times. And that is the tertiary or quaternary fever I'm referring to. That's what people would have experienced, meaning that every 3 or 4 days, there's a fever spike, and it corresponds to the life cycle of the disease organism itself, the laying of eggs, the hatching of eggs, the blood that is necessary to produce the milieu that the eggs need for nutrients, and this periodic, the cycling of fever and cold. I myself have had a tropical disease, or even in the southeastern part of the United States, this used to be a problem of roundworm, which invades the body and sits in the lungs and hatches eggs, and you move it throughout the body. Pretty disgusting, but it is what it is. And you have to take some kind of purging medication to get rid of this organism. My partner has had malaria. He's worked in Kenya for 25 years, on and off. So it was, in a sense, kind of close. And again, all of this is resources from Ross so that
Sure.
you can write.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as the alchemists, okay, the alchemists, when I think of alchemy, like I think of magical, but I don't think that's necessarily how you're using it, more like scientific. And when you were talking about the dyes that were created through alchemy, that sounds like almost like chemistry to me. Could you talk a little bit more about the alchemy aspect?
I'll say it is chemistry. It is pre-chemistry, pre this chemical body of knowledge. I wanted alchemy to be magic. I wanted it to be esoteric and occult science. That's what I wanted it to be.
Mhm.
And I wanted to make Bianca this great mysticist. But when I looked into alchemy at the time, it mostly was for this basically pre-capitalist manufacturing. And I couldn't really find, even in some of the texts, much mysticism to speak of. I mean, there's classic, the Hermetic texts, the meditation on the Cabal, for example, and there's religious traditions that kind of meditate on even possibly mathematics. Mathematics is the pure Renaissance science that could, because there was 2 and 2 equals 4, it always equals 4. That's a kind of perfect science, readily available science. So, but it didn't go very deep. And the deepest way to think about it is in terms of a Goethean science, which lives now at, for example, the Goetheanum in Dornach, Switzerland, and certainly at research centers in Germany. And that is a kind of phenomenology of thought, kind of like humanistic, phenomenological way of prioritizing and elevating observation so that most of the science is coming from observation without pattern seeking, which really bucks against conventional scientific method. So, disappointment there. The best way to access the alchemy of magic is to go to the Goetheanum in Switzerland. And that's where I've actually taken students for 15 years. I myself have had a sabbatical there at the Goetheanum in the natural sciences section. And I often go to the yearly conferences, sometimes presenting. So this dive into armchair history, if you will, didn't yield many results. So the kind of alchemy I'm finding is an industrial alchemy that is really held very strongly in the hands of men. That's why she needed to do something different and kind of be a champion of the scientific method. And so it's not so much scientific method, perhaps, although there's hidden references in the book to Galileo and to others who were both occultists and scientists, so-called scientists. But she is advocating a more systematic way of answering questions, and that's through testing. So that you don't test, and you don't really test on a large population in the alchemy that we would be familiar with by looking at the historical text. So that's her departure from the world of men, and her mother's departure too. And the aunties in the first chapter in Bianca's Cure, they're saying, what is this about? Using the alembic, distillations, that's men's science. They want the big out laboratories. They want these big results. That's not how women work. So that starts to create the separation of certainly Bianca's mother and then Bianca from the world of the aunties.
Interesting. Going back to Artemisia, I know I say her name wrong, Gentilis. That's one of the things that intrigued me about her as well. She's a woman in this men's world, and yet she departs, and yet she also adds to the art of the time period in a way that is visible and maybe subjective, but maybe not. And so I find your character really fascinating because of that as well, and the way that you've done that. Maybe talk a little bit more about that her being a woman, having agent and yet having agency, and how you saw that in the real academic history as well as in your own kind of creative creation of her as a character in your book.
Yeah, I will say one thing about the Artemisia Gentileschi that, she's in the 1600s. She, supposedly was the first woman that was allowed into the academia. And, it's in the tradition of Caravaggio, who is better known. And yeah, and her struggles have been well documented and well fictionalized also. So, yeah, a woman in this challenging world, I think there's a little bit more an incredibly beautiful woman in this challenging world. So, Montaigne and others write about her beauty, her great beauty. And um, so now she's in this world and she's standing apart for her beauty. And early on in chapter one in Bianca's Cure, she's saying, "Pretty doesn't matter to me," and it's like Mama says, it's just something that you use. In a certain way, you can look at Bianca Capello as this great strategist, and almost in a Machiavellian sense, she got what any woman needs to do their work, which is resources and a space.
Mm-hmm.
We know she had the resources. She was Grand Duchess of Tuscany. I've got some of her letters that she wrote. I have images of the letters that I took in archives
Mm-hmm.
of her letters. And we know she had a space because there is this studio space hidden in Palazzo. What did a woman need at the time to get ahead, to do
Mm-hmm.
their work? And how did they find their own agency? And develop it. That's what you're asking. One way in which women did this at the time was to become a nun. So, as Meredith Ray points out, it could be that 1 in 8 women we know could be 1 in 6, 1 in 4, but 1 in 8 is still a startling statistic. Were nuns in Florence, and nunneries were basically where oftentimes sick people were, apothecaries were, and they were, in a sense, safe places in which women could work. And in
Mm-hmm.
my book, Bianca realizes that, and she is trying to find these monasteries, nunneries, wherever she can. In Venice, she tried Padua, and in Florence, the one that she arrives at that she's desperate to get to, even from her time in Florence, is Santa Elisabetta. But Santa Elisabetta is actually an amalgam of different convents, different orders, different apothecaries, different sick places. And we know it today as Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents on the Piazza della Santissima Annunziata, on the Holy Annunciation Plaza, or the Plaza of the Two Fountains. I should also say that is the plaza too, where there is an open window, which got me started on this story to begin with. I was walking across the piazza with an Italian friend, and she said, "Gigi, turn around." And because I said, I'm interested in Francesco de' Medici and the Medicis. And actually, the first 100,000 words I wrote, which I threw away, were from this perspective of Francesco, was a male perspective. And it just didn't resonate. It read like a Wikipedia article. So I rewrote the story of Bianca Capello, especially when she told me the spirit of Bianca Capello lives there. And if you close the window, she screams. And I went to the Loggiata dei Serviti, which is which is at the angle of that open window, this massive hotel.
Wow.
And I asked inside, wormed my way inside, asked if they heard a scream. Yes, they heard a scream. And if you just Google open window Florence, you'll get that legend. And it won't be Bianca Capello, it'll be some lover of Ferdinando, because Ferdinando, the cardinal, the nemesis, the antagonist in the book, is sitting as part of a bronze statue on top of a horse, looking at the open window. And that's what got me started. But at any rate, in that piazza is where a lot of the action takes place. But generally speaking, in a real sense, women had agency in these convents, in these
Yeah,
nunneries.
I love that you said that. Not to talk about me, but I'm gonna for a second. A book that I'm publishing in the this year is one of my favorite characters was a woman from a house of nobility, fictitious character. And what I realized is that same thing. She became a nun because it gave her agency. And I've never heard anybody say that. And I get chills thinking that you just said that about the nuns,
Mhm.
because it's kind of something that I decided on my own without much kind of support for that. But I love that. I'm all about this, the history, your process for this, everything, and the serendipitous moment where you're telling your friend, and then your friend tells
Yes.
you, see that window? That's like alchemy in a magical kind of way.
And remember, we were talking about magic, and I'm like, whoa, I'm all about that. In fact, I've even stayed, part of my research is staying in the room right next to the open window. So
Oh, wow.
here's the open window, and here, and waiting for inspiration. I would say maybe one time in four, I get inspiration from being a little disappointing. I needed other sources. Yes. So
I
besides your book that's coming out, Anne Marie Cannon, besides your book, I mean, I really encourage people to pick up Meredith Ray's Daughters of Alchemy, and in which that's discussed
oh,
and
cool. Um,
substantiated.
boy, I still have so many questions, but we're kind of running out of time, and I don't want to go over. I know you have your own schedule. I guess, what do you want people to know about this history? If my listeners walked away with one thing, what is the key point you would like to leave them with?
I'm going to cheat and give 1 point about the character, a persona, and 1 point about a place. A character that always, whoever you are, in whatever structures you find yourself, one can work kind of this way in this system and, I don't know, horizontal, for lack of a better word, kind of within the system and try and work with your agency. and and so always it's a question whether you're a woman or whether you are identifying with those characteristics, male, female, trans, whatever, of finding how to have the space and resources to do your work. The other main point is about Florence itself. Florence today is a Disneyland. Florence has hundreds of thousands of tourists. It's people see Florence as one of 60 people in a tour bus getting off of the tour bus. And the message of my book is there's a way to see Florence in a different light, which is the Florence of mysticism and secrets and struggles for agency of 500 years ago that still ring true today and might inform those our challenges today with that. And you can do it by visiting what may seem like secret places that were even secret at the time, but yet were sources of inspiration for people who are struggling. And that is the way to see Florence, not as one stop on the grand tour, not in a tour bus with 59 other people. There's inexpensive, really rewarding ways to do that. Florence doesn't need to become a city of Airbnb. Venice has already instituted a tourist tax, shutting out Fiorentini from their homes. That's not how it was 100 years ago. That's
Mm,
not how it was 500 years ago. So there's a different way to imagine Florence, which is very rewarding.
I love that. You're reminding me of the interview I just dropped this week, and it's a completely different topic, but everything you said resonates with what I got out of that interview. And that's Dr. Kama Ennis, who is a
Mhm.
Black female doctor who, there's only, of all the doctors, I think in the world or the United States, I'm not sure about this, but it's like just over 2% are female Black doctors. And the thing that I saw and heard from her documentary was exactly what you just said. And that is that, yeah, the odds were against them. They got a lot of flack for they had to work 1,000 times harder to get to where they were. But the ones who have been really successful in history are the ones who were like, they figured out their resources and what they had to work with, and they worked with it. They kept it close to their chest, maybe what they thought about the bull crap, to use an academic word, but and I love that theme. I love that theme that you just covered, because it really, I do try to look at kind of hidden histories, lost histories, that type of thing. And I feel like this is so more on target than I even thought of when I read the press release for you. So I've
Thank
really
you. It's more common than we think, and even more successful perhaps than we might imagine. Women and others who are just unheard, trying to find ways to, like I say, do their work. And I would just like to invite people interested in Bianca's Cure. If you just go to my website, just my name, Gigi Berardi, I think .com. But anyway, and get into the blogs. I'm answering these exact questions, especially if they're coming from readers, and how we can look at history in a way that we can see this particular effective strategy.
interesting. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about?
You got such good questions.
I know. I feel
And
like we could talk all day. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. And so I definitely want people to go to your website and find you. Have you written other works of historical fiction?
no,
Oh, wow. Wow. And you're published through She Writes?
yes. So this is through She Writes Press. It's distributed through Simon and Schuster. But in the past, I've had many publishers, big five kind of publishers. And so it's always different. Big shout out to She Writes Press. But also, and I really feel that once you're in a place where you can spend some resources on a team to work with you, that PR Red, Anne Marie Nevis, and also in Florence, the Book Whisperer, that I'm working with them now, and that's who will be putting out the Italian version of the book and the German translation. We're starting that these women, these are run by women and for women, for unheard voices.
I've actually just interviewed two women who have written historical fiction that are published by She Writes.
Perfect. And I
Yeah.
also see that you've interviewed Janice Robinson Daly. I think
Yeah,
that was in
she's one of
January.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Janice chose Bianca's Cure as one of 31 titles for Women's History Month
Oh, of course she
this March.
did.
Yeah. And of
Yeah.
course, it's first because of Bianca's Cure. Thank you, She Writes Press, for that. And but we're having that launch. I'm sure she mentioned it on March 5th, and that's going to be fun. Yeah. It's a circle. It's a network.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Good stuff out of She Writes. And where can we find you?
GigiBerardi.com. And I think if you just Google Bianca's Cure, probably at this point, but Gigi maybe and Bianca, you'll get to the Simon & Schuster website. You'll get to my website. And my website will have articles. So for example, there was a huge exhibition that opened on February 7th in Milan for the Olympics, and by a German artist, and it's called The Women Alchemists. And it's about the women that I'm talking about, with vague references, I must add, but in my book. But I have a blog on that, what that means. And so I would just encourage people just to go to my website and then to email me. I'm not difficult to find because of the university that I teach at, I'll say.
Okay, great. That is great. I'm going to thank you. Thank you for being here today. I have really enjoyed our conversation. I'm so intrigued, and I do think that my listeners will also be intrigued by this history.
Thank you, Anne Marie. Such a pleasure. Such a pleasure.
Thanks for spending time with me on Armchair Historians. If you enjoyed this episode, the easiest way to support the show is to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you can, leave a rating or review, or share the episode with a friend who loves history. You'll find my website and links to everything we discussed in the show notes, along with ways to support the show more directly, whether that's joining the community, supporting financially, or simply helping more listeners to discover the podcast. And don't forget, the show notes also include a free short story download that introduces readers to Bedlam from my soon-to-be-released historical fiction series. Until next time, keep asking questions because history is anything but finished.